Welcome back everyone, it's Deborah Kent here again, and this week we will be examining in more detail the grace of the first week in and through Ignatius's own life and learnings. We reflected previously on Ignatius's own spiritual formation, and now we're going to examine how he formed others and his training methods. Look, it would be pleasing for all of us to reflect on this. Ignatius did not always enjoy success in forming his companions or those who sought his counsel. When we read his autobiography, that while he was at Manresa, in addition to his 7 hours of prayer a day, he was, quote, occupying himself helping some souls who would come and find him there in spiritual matters. That's in paragraph 26. Please note the word helping. We're going to return to this time and time again when we examine in more detail Ignatius's own way of formation. This help extended to both men and women. When Ignatius returned from the Holy Land, seekers gathered around him, including Isabel Rosa, who we met last week. We had a look at Ignatius's letter to her. We know very little about the counsels Ignatius gave while giving direction. We do know that a number of prominent families maintained their relationship with Ignatius and led very committed Christian lives. Some of this spiritual counselling direction was continued via letter. We see this in the case of Isabel Rosa. Therefore, it's not unusual that today we see ongoing spiritual direction conducted via Skype and other electronic means. Catherine of Siena is another saint whose spiritual counsel was often conducted via the post. Isabel Rosa is an interesting case study. While she was truly committed to her faith, she was not necessarily led to a life of sanctity. In fact, it was her attempts to establish a community of women and the difficulties she caused with this ambition that may have led Ignatius to abandon the idea of pursuing a female branch of the society. He did enjoy success with converts in Barcelona, so much so that an assassination attempt was made on his life, which returned him to his convalescence bed for another 2 months. He did win the commitment of 3 companions in this period, who were the first to share his way of life, but this group dispersed when Ignatius left for Paris. At Alcala, while he attracted others, only his confessor Miona and Diego de Uja later entered the society. Also in Alcala, there were a small group of women auditors who were drawn to Ignatius. From the church investigations, that is the Inquisition, into Ignatius's activities, we do have some knowledge of the advice they received from Ignatius. He showed them the service of God, it was reported, and explained to them the 3 faculties, the 5 senses, the commandments of God, venial and mortal sin. He instructed them to make an examen of conscience twice daily and confess and take communion once a week. This regime constitutes the first week of the exercises. Also recognisable here in these reports is what we now know as the 3 methods of prayer, which you can find in the spiritual exercises, paragraph 238 and following. I'll just pause here and have a look at these instructions. Ignatius also encouraged them not to be discouraged by desolations that interrupted their consolation. This advice anticipates the rules for discernment of spirits in the first week of the exercises. So we see in this period Ignatius had already begun to shape the methods which constitute the spiritual exercises. At this time, he was sufficiently mature in his own spiritual formation to be able to counsel, guide, and instruct others. In Paris, there's no evidence of a woman's apostolate in the life of Ignatius. However, this may be due to the barrier of language, for Ignatius initially enjoyed success among Spanish-speaking men. In Flanders, he gave the exercises to Juan de Castro, Pedro de Peralta and Amador, and this experience brought about a dramatic change in their lives, which also led to problems for St. Ignatius. In Ignatius's reminiscences, you'll find on page 50 in your text, paragraph 77, the following account regarding these conflicts. Reading from the text. When he came back for the first time from Flanders, he began to give himself more intensively to spiritual conversations than he normally did, and he gave exercises to 3 people almost at the same time, namely to Peralta, to the bachelor Castro, who was in the Sorbonne, and to Biscayan, who was in St. Barbe called Amador. These made major changes in their lives and at once gave all they had to poor people, even their books. They began to beg for alms around Paris and went to lodge in the almshouse of St. Jacques, where the pilgrim had formerly been, but which he had now left for reasons spoken of earlier. This caused great commotion in the university because the first 2 of these were distinguished people and well known. At once the Spaniards began a campaign against the 2 masters. Not being able to overcome them with many arguments and means of persuasion to return to the university, many of them went out one day armed and took them out of the almshouse. And bringing them to the university, they arrived at the following agreement. After they had finished their studies, then they could pursue their intentions. None of these retreatants remained with him in the long term to actually form the society, but many did commit to other forms of religious life and disciplined lives in the faith. On August 15th, 1534, this is a significant date in the history of the Society of Jesus and in the life of Ignatius, a group did bind themselves with Ignatius to serve Christ and the Pope. They were Favre, Xavier, Lainez, Salmeron, Bomadilla and Rodriguez, along with Leger, Brouet and Coudieu, who joined them a short time later. We can divide up the formation period of the first companions into 2 sections. 1539 to 40 was really the formation of a religious order, 1530 to 1540, and I refer you at this time to annotation 20. Just pause here and have a read of that annotation at the beginning of the spiritual exercises. In the annotations, and there are 20 of them, the 20 introductory reflections. Here we're going to examine in some detail. These are reflections for both the maker and the giver of the exercises, and they actually serve to initiate the retreatant into the experience of the spiritual exercises. Spiritual exercises, for those of you who have the text, begin on page 282. Additionally, there are, in paragraph 21, a reflection on the title of the spiritual exercises, and also the presupposition describing the way to proceed with the experience effectively. The spiritual exercises is Ignatius's approach of one way of journeying towards God and discovering where God may be leading and calling the retreatant. The framework of the exercises is identity, vocation, and mission. This is the rhythm of the experience of one who enters into the journey that is the spiritual exercises. Ignatius links the spiritual exercise to the idea of physical exercise. Reading the first annotation, what do you notice about Ignatius's deliberately chosen list? The progression of this analogy is very important. Note the order: strolling, walking, running. So the first stage is a meandering, then a determination to reach a destiny, and then haste to do so. To understand the exercises, you need to be alert to this sense of progress. This is a very helpful approach for those of you leading others in your ministries. Remembering Ignatius experienced many failures in leading others to God and helping them to identify their vocation and mission. The annotations have been formed based on that experience and the experience of others giving the exercises. This is not a process you can rush. You may not see the results. You must begin gently and build. The process is a measured one and also one of continual advancement. There is both increase and change. For your homework, over the next week, read the spiritual exercises attentively and reflectively. Be alert to the movements within the text and record your reflections under spiritual exercises on the Week 3 forum. The spiritual exercises is a process of discovery of the work and movement of God in your life. It is aimed at seeking to find the divine will in our lives, identity, vocation, and to embrace it, mission. So, what do these annotations reveal to us of the process? The text for the director is a series of texts gleaned from the wisdom of experience of having given the exercises and having done the exercises. This text was constantly revised by Ignatius in the light of his own experience and also in the light of the experience of his companions. This tradition is not static. There are many texts on the market today offering different approaches to the exercises. The one who gives and the one who receives the exercises contribute to this dynamic process. Every one of us entering into the experience of the exercises contribute to this dynamic tradition. The text is a relational one. It is the relationship between the giver, the retreatant or maker, and God. Jesuit Howard Gray says, quote, "The one giving the exercises, the one making the exercises, and the God of the exercises are helping one another to come to an understanding of how the experience can become contextualized, become a reality in the who I am." This text demands of the giver to be present to it and the retreatant, and also the movement of the retreatant's spiritual journey. The spiritual exercises are part of a wider reality, Ignatian spirituality. This includes other writings by Ignatius, such as the Constitutions of the Society of Jesus, Ignatius's writings, all of them including his letters. Today there are many directories and commentaries on the text of the exercises. The annotations were the first form of these. They take the form of wide-ranging notes gleaned from experience of giving the exercises to assist others as they give them and to assist the one making the exercises. Through experience, Ignatius and his companions learned what works, what didn't. To explain what Ignatius meant by something, sometimes in the tradition of Ignatius, companions felt it necessary to unpack what Ignatius meant in his original thought. The annotations and directories and commentaries guide to help the text to become accessible to individuals. Let's look at the assistance given by the annotations. As I said, some are intended for the exercitant or the maker of the exercises, one for the giving of the exercises. Ignatius never uses the term director because in Ignatian spirituality and in the experience of the exercises, there is only one director for Ignatius, and that director is God. Ignatius always gave the exercitant annotations 1, 20, 5 and 4. We've already looked at annotation 1. Before continuing to the next slide, first read annotation 20, then annotation 4 and annotation 5. We'll be looking at these in the next part of this lecture. Annotation 5 is very important as it speaks about the disposition required of the retreatant. The most important thing for you to look for in one seeking to do the exercises is the desire to do them. Why? Because they wish to do something with their life. There should be evident a desire to be open to what God is calling me to and to be open to the revelation of that vocational call. At the beginning of the exercises, the one giving them is looking for people with deep ambition to be in God's service and to render that service in totality. We are not looking for sanctity or perfection, but rather focusing on the desire. Preparation to enter into the exercises must be practiced without haste. The one giving the exercises before commencing them must be confident that the one making the exercises will be helped by the experience and not burdened by it. The exercises, to use a term borrowed from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, are not cheap grace. To enter into them unprepared risks missing out on their treasures. Annotation 4 describes the structure of the experience, what to expect during the 30 days, or if done in daily life, what to expect over the 35 weeks. The main reflection before entering the exercises is on the current state of the retreatant. Where am I? It's important when looking at the spiritual exercises and reflecting upon the graces therein to pay attention to the very deliberate choice of words that Ignatius used. Let's look first at the every way. We came across this in annotation 1. Every way of examining one's conscience. This is not a program, a one-size-fits-all. Ignatius knows this is a messy process and will be a journey taken by a diversity of people. Note in annotation 1 the phrase every way. Every way of preparing and disposing. There are patterns in our lives of ways of being open to God. The soul refers to the whole person. It is the whole person, and note the word rid, the whole person must rid themselves of disordered attachments. Pause here and write some brief reflections on the forum about what you think Ignatius might have meant by this. So, there's a caution here. The exercises are not about what I do, but about what I see. They are revelatory. Each of us in our lives have false idols before us. We must become aware of what they are and then stop worshipping them. A meditation suggested by Ignatius is to reflect meditatively on the 10 Commandments, taking each one in turn. Perhaps you might like to use this as a meditation at some point during the week. You will note that by using the 10 Commandments as a text for meditation, the first commandment is a meditation about the singular devotion to God. So, what is the end purpose and nature of the exercises? This discovery of who I am and who I am before God, who God is for me, and what God is inviting me to see in myself and in my life, and enter into where I am called to make me whole. It is about the discovery of disordered tendencies and the ability to deal with them so that they cease to be a block to the wholeness and fullness of life. Love governs every virtue. So how do you remove all things in your reality that make you not a loving person? What is the central way towards making good decisions? Ignatius, when assessing suitability of a person to make the exercises, he is looking for consistency and generosity so that the dynamics of God's grace can operate in the person's mind and heart. During this progress, it is important to pay attention to moods. If you look at paragraph 17. The practice of discerning spirits, paragraph 15. A drive and orientation towards the future. And paragraph 16, desiring to move from prayer to service. Pause here and read 17, 15 and 16 before continuing. The exercises are not ends in themselves, but as Howard Gray says, they are rather preludes to prayer. We're going to turn our attention now to what is termed the presupposition. Before continuing, pause here and read 23. The presupposition articulates the pastoral aspect of the text. All pastoral activity in Ignatian spirituality is mutual. Both lives are enriched in and through the grace of God. Both that of the maker and the giver of the exercises. In Ignatian spirituality, the central idea is one of mutuality. The giver's attentiveness and interventions are not only helping the one making the retreat, they are also helping them. As God is a helping God, the evidence to look for during this process is consolation. The early works of the Jesuits were called consolation ministries. Detecting consolation in our lives and prayer indicates to us the workings of God. Consolation identifies for us the works of the Holy Spirit. You recall very early in Ignatius' spiritual development, he began to realise that his immediate enjoyments with secular things left him feeling dry. This made him more attentive to those activities, and also he wished to embrace those activities which left him feeling consoled. Both the giver and the maker of the exercises must trust that God is working in the relationship between them, and they must establish a trust with one another. There is no passivity in this relationship. Both must be willing to let things go. There is no aim in this relationship to foster a personal relationship, although this may happen, but rather to foster a deep and abiding relationship with God. The object is not to become dependent on the director, but rather to become dependent upon God. For those of you who are either being formed as givers of the exercises or thinking about it, this is a very important thing to remember, that the one who is giving the exercises is there to help the maker become dependent upon God and not dependent upon them. The first companions made the exercises in 1 month. In this period, there was a requirement, and we're looking at now 1541 onwards, that new companions must first make the exercises during a month or in an hour and a half each day. This requirement foreshadows annotation 19. Pause here to read annotation 19. In 1550, the constitutions make clear the role of the exercises in the formation program within the society. Quote, "For greater enlightening of their understanding, and for enkindling themselves to the love of Christ, and for making themselves thereafter more fervent in their works, it will be useful for them to make the spiritual exercises during a month, as it is said in the General Examen. The choice of the time will be left to the direction of the superior." End quote. However, it is well documented that this varied between candidates. Yet the constants were: the foundation and the kingdom were foundational starting points from which a Jesuit vocation flowed for Ignatius. What I'm referring to here about the exceptions, that some of the early companions, the early Jesuits, either only made the first week or had made the exercises earlier, and some made them in different parts. However, regardless of whether they made the exercises in their entirety or only sections of them, the foundation and the kingdom were always included in the formation process. In 1555, da Camara made a note in his journal, quote, "The practice followed in Spain of giving the exercises at the beginning is good in general. I recall that the father," he's referring to Ignatius, "the first companions made the exercises in 1 month. In this period there was a requirement that 1541 onwards, new companions must first make the exercises during a month or for an hour and a half each day. This direction foreshadows annotation 19. Pause here to read this annotation before proceeding. In 1550, the constitutions make clear the role of the exercises in formation within the society. Quote, "For greater enlightening of their understanding and for enkindling themselves the love of Christ, and for making themselves thereafter more fervent in their works, it will be useful for them to make the spiritual exercises during a month, as it is said in the General Examen. The choice of the time will be left to the direction of the superior." End quote. However, it is well documented that this varied between candidates. Yet the constants were the foundation and the kingdom. These were always the starting points from which a Jesuit vocation flowed for Ignatius. And regardless of how long Jesuits spent or others spent making the exercises, whether it was only the first week, whether it was only a section of it, or whether the exercises in their entirety, it is the foundation and the kingdom which are essential to the experience of making the exercises. In 1555, de Camara made a note in his journal, quote, "The practice followed in Spain of giving the exercises at the beginning is good in general. I recall that the father," refers to Ignatius, continuing the quote, "told me one day that he did not wish anyone sent to college without first having made the exercises, at least those of the first week, along with the methods of praying." Read the principle and foundation first before proceeding. That is paragraph 23 in the text of the spiritual exercises. In the 1599 directory compiled by those who had experience in giving the exercises, describes the foundation as the groundwork of the whole moral and spiritual edifice of the exercises. The focus is on how God is revealing himself to you, not how you should act in the light of your experience. The foundation is known as a consideration. It differs from a meditation or a contemplation. It draws your attention to reflect upon the meaning of creation, including your own. You as part of the creative process in relationship with the Creator and all that is created. You reflect on this in dialogue with the giver of the retreat, and through this conversation, you arrive at a new level of understanding and insight. This lays important preparatory ground before the retreatant enters into the experience of the exercises. It was intended that time should be given to this consideration. It should not be reflected upon in haste. Moving to the principle and foundation, or to examine it, when we look at it, we see that its original intent is that it would be a religious experience. And by that I mean truly an encounter with God as described in annotation 15. We pause here now to read annotation 15 before continuing. This encounter with God, this deep religious experience, would occur in an instructional conversation given between the maker and the giver of the exercises and prior to entering into the first week. In practice, this means that the giver of the exercises would invite the maker to a conversation. Prior to commencing the 19th or 20th annotation, they together would reflect deeply on what it means to the retreatant to be made by God, how they see themselves and God in relationship together and to the entirety of created reality. The foundation has been present in the ordering of the exercises from its very beginnings. It was certainly included in the 1548 version of the text. It orients the exercitant to a single end, our place before God as human and servant, to recognise the means to that end and to indicate the condition of indifference that enables the retreatant to deliberate without distraction. It allows the exercitant's reader to be enlightened by faith. It forms part of a process of purification, detachment. It's to be reflected upon in conjunction with the general confession. Together, these considerations lead the retreatant to a state of indifference as expressed in the foundation. Now, historically, there are different approaches and understandings of this annotation, some more enriching than others. A contemporary approach can be found in David Fleming's text. Reading from Fleming's book. God who loves us creates us and wants to share life with us forever. Our love response takes shape in our praise and honour and service of the God of our life. All the things in this world are also created because of God's love, and they become a context of gifts presented to us so that we can know God more easily and make a return of love more readily. As a result, we show reverence for all the gifts of creation and collaborate with God in using them so that by being good stewards, we develop as loving persons in our care for God's world and its development. But if we abuse any of these gifts of creation, or, on the contrary, take them as the centre of our lives, we break our relationship with God and hinder our growth as loving persons. In everyday life, then, we must hold ourselves in balance before all creative gifts, insofar as we have a choice and are not bound by some responsibility. We should not fix our desires on health or sickness, wealth or poverty, success or failure, a long life or a short one. For everything has the potential of calling forth in us a more loving response to life forever with God. Our only desire and our one choice should be this: I want and I choose what better leads to God's deepening life in me. This ends the section from Fleming's book. So, given the number of interpretations and approaches to the foundation, what was its original intent? We turn to one of Ignatius's wingmen, Polanco, for an interpretation. Now, Polanco, as with Nadal, who we met last week, was a loyal and close companion of Ignatius and also secretary of the society. He felt that the most important reality was that contained in the principle and foundation. for this was the opportunity to begin to explore what religious experience meant in the life of one making the exercises. Now, over the centuries, others have opposed this view and rather saw it as a process, an opportunity to recognise your duty to fulfil the plan of God that was applied to all. Howard Gray, S.J., in the tradition of Polanco, says that the foundation is an experiential period of reflection, focusing on the individual's personal call by a loving God within the community of created reality, a direct discovery of who God is for them. I ask you now to pause here for 20 minutes or so and spend some time meditating and praying over the text of the foundation. What is the movement in this text? What is the meaning of the foundation? Once you've completed your 20 minutes of silent reflection, write your own explanatory note for the foundation on the forum. You should find there other students' explanatory notes which you can react to and comment on. So now, returning, after that meditation on the foundation, let's continue examining it. The movement of the foundation is one which is revelatory, not didactic. It doesn't tell you what God will say to you. It is individual. All will go through and advance in this stage at their own pace and in their own way. It is an activity of God through the person's whole life. Remembering Scripture, before you were formed in the womb, God knew you personally, individually, lovingly, and reveals himself to you personally. God reveals himself as the one chosen, loved as I am and for who I am. This is how we are in God's view. The principle and foundation is introducing what will continue to be developed through the exercises and reach its finality in the election. Who am I? What do I think God is calling me to be? This will be an ongoing creative vision that is played out in your life vocation. The text of the foundation invites the exercitant to pray, and in their prayer to discover by remaining attentive to the consolations they experience and the guidance they receive in their prayer from the giver of the exercises and the movements of the Holy Spirit, where God is calling them during either the 30-day or 35-week retreat. Returning to an examination of the key terms in the text, let's look now at the term helpers. This is an important term that appears in Ignatius's autobiography, the Jesuit constitutions, and in Ignatius's correspondence. Ignatius's experience in the autobiography is the movement from where he begins with his austere practices which exhaust him, their external penitential actions which he is doing to imitate the great saints. He does them in such an extreme way that at one point he considers suicide. We see Ignatius, though, as he grows in his spiritual maturity, he then moves to an understanding that God is calling Ignatius not to be a St. Francis, not to be a St. Dominic, but rather to be Ignatius. God is calling Ignatius to be true to himself. Flowing from that then, in that discovery, God is drawing him out to help others to discover their true self before God. Knowing how to help others comes from knowing how God has helped us, and this is very obvious in the life of Ignatius and his spiritual journey. The sign of God in my life that I need to be attentive to is consolation. Ignatius called the early works of the Jesuits ministries of consolation. Howard Gray, S.J., terms this, quote, liberating them from the tyranny of performance so that they may enter into the grace of encounter. I think that's quite a lovely phrase from Howard Gray. Liberating them from the tyranny of performance so that they may enter into the grace of encounter. An encounter with who? An encounter with the Trinitarian God revealed to us in and through Jesus Christ. In paragraphs 2 and 3, we see the emphasis on the relationship. We are always in relationship with the rest of creation. I meditate on how all other creative reality leads me to God or is a distraction from God. Not everything is a helper for me. God is my only absolute. It is only when I enter into a distorted relationship with anyone other or anything other than God that I feel angry, upset, desolate. I need to relate to all out of the relationship with God as my absolute, and then and only then will I experience freedom. The term use them is one that Ignatius uses in the text, and this term can only be understood in the context of a loving, serving, and reverential relationship with God. It is not intended to be understood that one must use others as a tool or a utility, but rather you reverence the other, care for its service in its diversity. This term actually embraces and welcomes diversity. We are not abusers of creation, but rather we are in solidarity with creation. To rid oneself, another often repeated term, is not an act of dismissal or abuse. You reflect on this in depth in the next process in the exercises when you look at the general examen. Asceticism becomes a means to an end and not an end in itself, which is what Ignatius came to know in his spiritual practice. Love is the movement in the foundation, and this love is a forging of relationships. There are three key terms contained in the principle and foundation: indifference, use of, using things, and the margus, or the more, which appears in the 4th paragraph. These three terms are important but must be considered in the light of the created relationship. Indifference is not withdrawal or to become uncaring. Rather, it is a balanced approach of praising, glorifying, and serving God through the gifts of God. It is also an act of distinguishing that which I am especially called to praise, reverence, and serve, from that which others are called to praise, reverence, and serve. This is a distinguishing feature between the charisms alive in the church today. Each of us has a distinct vocation, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that draws us to a distinct mission in the church. Everyone born in the image and likeness of God is called individually by God and is inspired by a movement of the Spirit, the charismatic movement of the Spirit. Ignatius presents this approach in the rules in the 2nd week for the discernment of spirits. This commences from paragraph 313 onwards. Pause here to examine reflectively this text. So to conclude today's reflections and examination, ridding oneself cannot be achieved by effort alone, but rather it is only through grace that one can come to turn themselves fully towards God. The grace of the foundation is the desire to choose only that which lies at the heart of God's creative action, which is the freedom to love. This will manifest itself in our life differently to the way it manifests itself in another's life. The foundation draws us to find the voice of God in my life. It is therefore as relevant today as it was in the 1500s and in every century in between. The foundation is a prayer to be used by the exercitant, who is capable of making the full exercises in either of its forms. Making the full exercises is not an activity for every person, but only those who are able to fulfill those characteristics that Ignatius looked for and that are reflected in the annotations. It explores dispositions that will later be developed as one moves through the full exercises. So, we experience the mercy of God in this prayerful experience of the exercises, and we experience God's mercy as recreation, which continues long after we have ceased journeying with the spiritual exercises.